Convenient to debate motion number 5 on the welfare cap. I call the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, to move the motion.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move the motions that stand in the name of the Chancellor. The Charter for Budget Responsibility is, at its core, about fiscal responsibility. Its existence is born of the belief that stable public finances are the foundation for building a stronger economy for the whole country. Its purpose is to set out the government's approach to managing the nation's finances openly so that the British people know that their money has been handled carefully, and to give us a credible framework for action underpinned by the Office for Budget Responsibility, which the OECD remark is considered by many as a model independent fiscal institution. Given the challenges we currently face, honourable members may reasonably ask whether this is the appropriate time for a debate such as this. But the credibility of the government's fiscal plan is what has allowed us to act as we have and will allow us to act again if we need to. In other words, we are updating the Charter not simply for the sake of it, but to maintain what my right honourable friend the Chancellor at Budget called the path of discipline and responsibility. Madam Deputy Speaker, almost 2 years ago, in the face of the pandemic, we took bold and decisive action to commit unprecedented amounts of public money to support jobs and businesses across the UK. This, including support recently announced in response to the Omicron variant, has helped prevent long-term scarring to the British economy. The IMF praised our impressive, coordinated and extended policy response, while the OBR said that the cost of inaction would have been far higher. The government is proud of the decisions we've taken and that we continue to take, but we are not complacent. The pandemic has left us with the highest level of borrowing since the Second World War, and at nearly 100% of GDP, public debt will reach its highest level since the early 1960s. This is clearly not sustainable over the long term. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to keep debt under control for 3 key reasons. First, our level of debt means we're more vulnerable to changes in interest rates and to inflation. In fact, OBR analysis from July found that our sensitivity of debt interest spending to changes in interest rates is almost twice what it was before the pandemic. A single percentage point increase in interest rates and inflation, I will in one moment, would increase annual spending on debt interest by over $20 billion in 24-25, which is more than the entire Home Office budget for that year.
But could he comment on what difference, if any, he thinks it makes that a significant proportion of that debt is now owned by the Bank of England, which is 100% owned by the government on behalf of the taxpayers?
Less than 3 minutes.
The Bank of England has obviously helped to underpin our wider response to the crisis that we face, and clearly it does have a bearing on the relative significance of debt, but it would be simply irresponsible to leave ourselves exposed in the manner which we risk being if we fail to constrain the borrowing, which does risk otherwise becoming an unacceptable burden, and which would leave us, as I say, very vulnerable. 1% rise in interest rates would cost the Exchequer £22.8 billion in 2025-2026. That is a meaningful level of exposure and one which we want to take action to address. Yes.
Just maybe to help the Minister also, but would he also not point out the fact that under this government, the Bank of England has reduced the proportion of new debt issuances which are attached to rising inflation rates? So at least in the actions of the Bank of England over the last 2 or 3 years, that exposure has declined.
Yeah, my honourable friend is absolutely right. And look, we're in a position here where we're certainly not saying that we are in an untenable situation, but we are saying that it's important to meet our fiscal rules, to get debt falling as a percentage of GDP. And I think, as Conservatives, that's something we believe in. It's something which we've won elections for 4 times in the last 12 years on that basis. I think it's important we continue to uphold it.
Will you give way again?
One more time, and then I must make
further to that point of intervention. Isn't it the case he's quoting a gross figure for the impact of a rise in interest rates, and that quite a bit of that would be credited back to the Bank of England, who in turn could pay it back as a dividend to the Treasury?
Chief Secretary.
I think it remains the case that we need to make sure that our debt to GDP ratio is more sustainable than it is at present. And I don't think that's something which colleagues will significantly demur from. I do take the point, obviously, there is an interaction and a relatively circular nature of some of the interactions between the bank and the Exchequer, but nonetheless, it is important we control our public debt.